And thank you especially to Fred for agreeing to join us. Moa has kind of a track record of inviting really good people back. And that's because they always have more and updated things to say. I think Cliff Merriman invited Fred to his first MOA meeting, and for that, I'm eternally grateful. Fred probably doesn't remember this, but I'm probably one of the few people who invited him to come to a meeting once and he refused. So that was going to be a Board of Livestock meeting about bison. Cliff, who's from Phillips County, may understand why the answer to that request was no. But in any case, I believe that if we've learned anything from the last 50 years, and maybe especially in the last year, we've learned that we humans need to do a better job of mimicking, working in concert with, and protecting natural systems, both for our own benefit and for the benefit of the land and for the benefit of other species, both domesticated and wild. And I can't really think of anybody that I know of who has done a more thoughtful, more thorough, more long-lasting effort to really investigate that world. I'll leave it to Fred to tell us what he's going to focus on today, but I think we can be guaranteed that it will be interdisciplinary, well spiced with rigor, and probably surprising in some ways. And you do not have to be a livestock person to be interested in this. Fred's 3 book titles would suggest that this is largely about livestock, but I think you'll learn today that that's a too limited a way to think about Fred's work. I'll just give you the short version of the 3 titles and let Fred take it from there. The most recent book is titled Nourishment: What Animals Can Teach Us About Rediscovering Our Nutritional Wisdom. He wrote a book called Foraging Behavior, and he wrote a book called The Art and Science of Shepherding. And I will let Fred fill in the details as he sees fit. And thank you so much. And thank you to everybody for coming. Go ahead, Fred.
Okay, Becky, thank you very much for the kind words. I really appreciate it, and I'm sorry I didn't come to that meeting. I remember I remember that. I remember what was going on with the bison and the controversies. Let me get the share screen going here, and as I mentioned to both Becky and Jamie prior to the presentation, I'm so thrilled to be here with you. I remember the time that I came to the last conference and what a wonderful time I had. And that's my only regret, that we can't meet in person, but this is a next best. I mentioned to them too, though, if you have comments as we go along, I'm happy to make it interactive. This is just meant as food for thought. Anything I ever have said is really not meant to be some dogma or anything like that, but it was food for thought. And what I want to do today is, for those who have heard earlier talks, that is to blend some of the old, quote, old ideas with new ideas, with emerging things that I'm helping people on, and that are coming about in the scientific literature today. So that's what I'll do, and talk about this idea of let feed and food be our medicine, and why that is so important. And then this idea of nourishing the wisdom of the body. What is the wisdom of the body, and how can we nourish that? Which, the more I've thought about that, and I'll end on this note today, it seems quite challenging, actually, that whole idea. So let's launch into it. And thinking about natural systems and animals, and from when I was a young child, and probably you too, I was fascinated by all the wild creatures that were in the area where I was living. And you know, after a lifetime of working on this, it's just so obvious. Nobody has to tell any of these creatures what to eat, how to develop, how to replicate. They know how to do that. And that in itself is pretty interesting and amazing to me. You know, even the laboratory rat is pretty clever when it comes to food selection and many other things, but given choices, rats can rectify a whole bunch of different kind of deficiencies. If they're made deficient and then they're offered alternatives, they know what to eat to meet the needs for the deficit. And I find it really interesting, some of the studies nowadays where they make rats diabetic. Um, the rats will select diets that are devoid in carbohydrates and move mainly to protein and fat, which is the nutritionally wise thing to do under those circumstances. Um, I spent my lifetime, 45, 50 years on the ranch in Colorado for many years. And then, in research, studying food selection, nutrition, and health of herbivores. And um, it's been interesting over the years to talk to people who don't know so much about that. They see a cow out in the pasture and think, what an easy life. And there are probably no challenges at all involved in any of that. But, as you get into the plants and their behavior and animals and their behavior, you learn that there's a lot of challenges that animals face. As you look across a landscape like this one here, we know that some plant species and plant parts are nutritious, others are toxic. So that's a challenge in and of itself, given on any landscape 50, 100, 150 different species to try to sort out what to eat and what not to eat. Moreover, individual plants can be nutritious or toxic depending on the time of the day, from the morning to the afternoon they switch, the week, the season. So it's a moving target that animals are challenged to deal with. And then the resources available in the environment where a plant's growing. This paintbrush right here is going to be different chemically growing in this particular location than one growing perhaps over here. I'll come back to this several times during the presentation, but the site where a plant's growing, sunlight, nutrients, and water, and neighbors that are around you, and so forth, all influence that. So there's a lot of challenges that herbivores face. Well, the question we addressed over the years is, for wild animals or for domestic animals that forage on rangelands, how do they figure out? There are no nutritionists that tell wild animals what and what not to eat, no pharmacists, there's no veterinarians to treat them. They've got to do that all on their own. And we know that wild animals do a great job of that. And also domestic animals that have learned how to use the landscapes do a great job of that as well. Humans face similar kinds of challenges, actually. It's no small deal nowadays to try to find out which is the most nutritious foods in a particular supermarket. Talk more about this as we go. So we face a nutrient challenge. What are the most nutritious fruits, vegetables, meats, spices, all those kind of things. We also face toxin challenges. And though it may not be acute kind of toxicity we face challenges like animals on rangelands do. And I'm thinking of locoweed, this beautiful white flowered plant called locoweed. In the spring of the year, it's one of the first plants to appear. And it's highly nutritious plant. And so that sets up possibilities, if animals aren't being managed properly, for them to eat a lot of locoweed. The problem is, even though it's nutritious, it has this delayed toxic effect that occurs over maybe 2 weeks to a month later, where the toxicity of the alkaloids in locoweed have their effect. Well, if you think about it, many of the processed foods, all of the processed foods that we have that same challenge. There's an immediate positive benefit, an energy boost from eating those foods, but there's this delayed kind of influence on overweight, obesity, metabolic syndrome, and so forth. And we also have spatial and temporal variability in where crops are grown, influencing their chemical characteristics. So we face a lot of challenges too when we go to the grocery store to try to forage. But unlike a wild creature, we're constantly being told by authority figures what and what not to eat. And I'm not meaning this to be like some big judgmental thing, but just think about if you're in this area. I can't even begin to tell you how many recommendations I see day in, day out for what and what not to eat and so forth. So the question is, and it's constantly changing. I want to end on that note, it's constantly changing. So people, don't even know what to do. So the question I want to pose is, do we lack the ability to identify and select nourishing diets, or has that ability been hijacked? And so let's pursue that as we go along. I want to begin, though, going back to the livestock part and talk about this notion of let feed be thy medicine. And I want to begin with a story here related to that. 45 years ago, I was working in southern Utah. I was working with goats on landscapes dominated by this shrub blackbrush. And we were using goats as mobile pruning machines during the winter to browse the plant and stimulate this lush new growth during the springtime so that we could improve the quality of the rangeland for cattle and for wildlife. That was the idea. And goats have been run down there historically in that way. But what we found was that after we did that the first year, when goats were offered these plants with the new growth, they strongly preferred to eat the old growth, not the new growth. And why that's so ironic is the new growth is much higher in energy and protein and minerals than the older woody growth. So the question was at that point, well, why are they doing that? When I told that to some of my professors at Utah State University, they said, well, I just guess that just goes to show that domestic animals lack nutritional wisdom. And that 45, 50 years ago, that was the feeling, is that wild animals still have it, but as a result of 10,000 years of domestication, cattle, sheep, goats, so forth, have lost their ability to self-select diets that meet their needs. So when I think about back over the years, then I think about this wisdom of the body and what that is and how that works. And there are basically three legs to the stool of nutritional wisdom. And I'm going to make the case that all the domestic animals and we humans as well still have nutritional wisdom. But if you break any one of these legs of the stool, it can't be manifest. And so the first is this idea for herbivores of plant diversity. If animals don't have a diverse array of forages to select from, there's no way that they're able to meet their needs, not only for nutrients, but also for medicines to self-medicate. The same we can say for we humans in terms of wholesome plant and animal foods, good variety, like the kinds that you would be growing organically. So that's one leg to the stool. The second leg are these biochemically mediated flavor feedback relationships. And what that is simply that to realize that our liking for food and the liking of livestock as well is being mediated by cells and organ systems throughout the body. It's not something that we consciously think about. This feedback occurs automatically after we ingest foods, and it changes our liking for the flavor of food as a function of need. The third leg of this stool for many animals, including humans, is the social, cultural, transgenerational linkages. And to realize that the importance of that these experiences in the womb and early in life are beginning to influence what animals consider to be food or not to be food. That's the third leg to the stool. So what I want to do is talk about each of these legs of the stool and start with this idea of plant diversity and these flavor feedback relationships and focus first off on livestock. And then I'll move later on into this idea of diversity and the social culture part for both humans and for livestock as I go. So if I were to ask you why you like a particular food, odds are that you would tell me because it tastes good. And you'd be in good company because that is our experience and that is how we are relating to food. If I were to ask you why you don't like a particular food, odds are you'd tell me you don't like it because it doesn't taste good. And again, you're in good company. But what we were finding with our studies, and it was the thing that for me was most shocking, actually, was that our liking for the flavor of the food is being mediated by these primary and what I'll refer to as secondary compounds, and they're changing our liking for food. So palatability ends up being more than a matter of taste. I'll show you a short video segment here just to illustrate that point for those who haven't seen it. Maybe most of you have by now. I've been showing it for a lot of years, but what it is simply demonstrating this idea of feedback and how it changes liking. And what we did, the workhorse that we used over the years to look at this was to first off make animals nutritionally deficient in a particular nutrient. And we weren't making them severely deficient, just mildly deficient. And then in the example I'm going to show you here, we were using straw as a food. And so on odd days, the conditioning went as follows. Animals in one group got apple flavored straw. Animals in the other group got maple flavored straw. And after they ate that straw, immediately after that, we simply drenched them directly into their stomach, or the rumen in this case, with water. Now on even days, we changed the flavors, but now we drench with the nutrient that they're lacking. And then we simply ask the animals a question. We give them a choice between apple and maple flavored straw. And the idea was that if they're associating the flavor of the food with feedback from the nutrient at this non-conscious level, then animals in group 1 should prefer maple to apple. Animals in group 2 should prefer apple to maple. And I can still remember the very first time we ran that experiment and walking down the line of the 24 different sheep, each in their individual pens, and you knew exactly which treatment the animals were in, because the food boxes were either no apple or no maple in the food boxes. So let me show you how that looks here. And in this case here, this was simply what we did at a short course. And people had conditioned animals to one group with the nutrient feedback to like straw. The other group was simply drenched with water, and so they can't figure out what's going on. So the one group loves straw and the other group can't figure out why they like it. And the only difference is simply the feedback that the one group received, the nutrient feedback as a result of eating the food. And so as Dave Barry, I always think of his quote, he says, what are calories? And if we were conditioning with energy, this would be the appropriate question. He says, calories are little units that measure how good a particular food tastes. Fudge, for example, has a great many calories, whereas celery, which is not really a food at all, but a member of the plywood family, provided by Mother Nature, so we have a way to get onion dip into our mouths at parties, has none. Add the feedback, and that's the essence of the whole idea of this. I'm going to make a long story really short here and simply say that we did so many studies with primary compounds and looking at feedback. We worked with energy, we worked with protein, we worked with them in different forms. We looked at ratios of energy to protein. We went on to work with minerals and to show, in fact, that animals can self-select minerals as a function of need. And then our colleagues in Australia went on to work with vitamin E. So over and over again, feedback is altering liking as a function of needs for energy. We also worked with these secondary compounds. And what I want to say next relates to both primary and secondary compounds. At the time we started the work, we had been doing a lot of work with plant ecologists looking at these so-called secondary compounds. And we all were thinking of them primarily as defenses. They're compounds that plants create to protect plants from being eaten by herbivores. But when we started to really get into this work here, what we learned was that it all depends on the dose. Um, if you have too high of a dose, then excesses animals avoid. And that's true for nutrients. Any nutrient in excess can be toxic. Any secondary compound in moderate amounts can lead to health benefits. So where we ended up, where I am nowadays in my thinking, is you have these incredibly complex interrelationships that are going on between primary and secondary compounds. And it's the relationships amongst all these and their doses, in a sense, that's influencing the degree to which animals are liking particular foods in a plant community, or that a human's liking particular foods. I'll elaborate on that as I go along. But I want to turn back by way of segue to this question: why do goats avoid eating the most nutritious new growth of blackbrush? The reason is that these new twigs are loaded with condensed tannins. They're about 70% tannin, and it's simply excessive for most goats. 80 to 90% of the goats simply can't handle that, so they avoid eating the current season's twigs. On the other hand, there's another 10 to 20%, that variability that's always out there amongst different individuals, that enables 10 to 20% of the animals to readily eat all the current season's growth they can eat. But the key point that I'm trying to make is simply that excesses of anything cause avoidance. And that's what was happening here. Strong defense of these new twigs. Now, as I mentioned early on, depending on where this blackbrush plant's growing, the environment where it's growing, the amount of sunlight, especially nutrients and water that the plant gets, if that plant there had a lot of nutrient additions, manure, let's say, and if it also had a lot of water, it would allocate more of its resources to growth than to those condensed tannins. So the palatability of the plant would change. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that plants respond biochemically to sunlight, moisture, nutrients, other plants in the environment, and then to pasture-bivory. And then the point I want to make is simply that herbivores are responding to the chemical characteristics of the plants, and they're very good at figuring that out. Beyond that, what I'd like to say is that plants and diverse arrays of plants turn dirt into soil, and diverse mixtures of plants turn soil into homes for herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores, both above and below ground. And I want to build on that point just a little bit about the diversity of plants and what that means. I remember 50 years ago or more now, when I was an undergraduate in wildlife biology, learning about the importance of diversity. Ecology was a fairly young discipline in those days, actually, but even then, people were talking about diversity. Diversity is important for systems. And I understood the words then, but after working with this for years and years, I just so appreciate that landscapes with diverse arrays of plants, when it comes to the topic for today, are literally nutrition centers and pharmacies with these vast arrays of phytochemicals that enable health for creatures below and above ground both. I'm going to talk quite a lot about primary and secondary compounds, and just to give you some examples: primary, energy, protein, minerals, vitamins. The secondaries are these broad classes of compounds: phenolics, terpenes, alkaloids, each with tens of thousands of different compounds within those categories. The details of that really don't matter, but it's simply to realize that these are all playing really important roles in systems. And here's some examples of, some plants, from trefoil to fescue, sandfoin, alfalfa, bitterbrush, sagebrush. Just give examples of some of the compounds that are in those. Like I say, those details for what I'll say today aren't so critical. But to give you some idea of the complexity of food, and I'll build on this as I go, if you look at primary compounds in spinach, this is just a subset of all of the primary compounds in spinach alone. Secondary compounds, here's just a subset of the secondary compounds that occur in oregano. So what I'm trying to say is plants are incredibly complex biochemically, and it's that complexity that becomes really important in health, in generating health. Rather than focusing on an individual compound, caffeic acid, or some fatty acid here like omega-3, it's the synergies that really count, and I'll build on that as I go too. But before I get to that, I'd like to say some words about these secondary compounds. You know, originally when biochemists were studying plants and they didn't know what roles these compounds played, they thought they were waste products of plant metabolism. And then they, as they studied them more and more, they came to see these other roles they were playing. And we realize now that these playing really fundamentally important roles in systems. And here's just a few examples of that. You know, everything from protection, sunscreen, to antioxidants, which we talk about so much nowadays, coloration, attract pollinators, fruit eaters. Allelopathic effects. Plants produce compounds that inhibit weed growth. Actually, they do it naturally through these secondary compounds. Resistance for drought, persistence in plant communities. And then when it comes to herbivores, recovery from injury, ability to regrow following grazing, plant defenses. These secondary compounds are playing multiple roles in the health of ecosystems. So over the last 50 years, people, and it's still a very active area of research, this whole idea of these secondary compounds. What's interesting to me, and again, this is not criticism in any way, but while you have one group of scientists, plant ecologists, so forth, studying these compounds and learning of their values, you have other groups of people who are working to reduce their concentrations in plants. And this goes for the crops that we grow. It goes for fruits and vegetables. It's been across the board, you know, and I think the primary reason for this, whether it's in pasture plants or crops or whatever, is that these compounds in too high amounts deter animals from eating the food. And so, and they also, there's a cost to them. If plants putting energy and nutrients into creating these compounds, it's not going to be able to put that same energy and nutrients into growth. And so it made sense back in those days that, well, listen, let's simply select for varieties that have low concentrations of these compounds. And you start with the wild ancestors who have rich arrays. And I think of that when we go on hikes in the fall here and you can pick 12 different berries from 12 different species. They've still got a really richness of phytochemicals, a bite to them that their modern day relatives don't have. So reducing concentrations to increase yields of crops and forages, maximize energy and protein as opposed to total phytochemical richness. But one of the downsides of that is we made plants more susceptible to environmental hardships. In their stead, then, we've come to rely on fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides to grow and protect plants in monocultures. All the pesticides, plant secondary compounds, that's a key role that they played in protecting plants. Herbicides, I mentioned that these allelopathic effects a minute ago. Plants produce naturally herbicides. And then this whole idea of fertilizers to enhance growth as opposed to the roles that plants and leguminous plants, for instance, play in that. You know, we're learning a lot nowadays through root exudates. Plants nurture life below ground, and through these mycorrhizal fungal networks, they create, they also nurture other plants. We know now that when we add fertilizer, NPK, to systems, the plants no longer need all of this life below ground, bacterial and fungal life. They become dependent then on the fertilizer itself, and so we break relationships, really healthful relationships within ecosystems, by when we fertilize, as opposed to allowing these natural processes to take place. We've also come to rely on antibiotics and antihelmintics to treat diseases and parasites. And yet there's a rich literature on everything from insects to small and large herbivores to primates to show that animals use phytochemicals to self-medicate. And they can do that in two ways. One is preventatively, prophylactically or preventatively. The other is to do that therapeutically. Finally, in what we've done too is to isolate and purify compounds to amplify their effects. But that simply has made resistance easier for bacteria, insects, and plants. And so now we have so much antibiotic resistance, pesticide resistant insects, herbicide resistant plants. When you get into the literature, you see that very commonplace. Well, plants and the diverse arrays of compounds they originally produced knew how to prevent that. And it had to do with diverse arrays of compounds, not isolating and purifying compounds. So plants have been playing these games for millennia. We're really newcomers at that. And the more we can study and learn from plants, I think the more we can use that in organic kind of agriculture and all agriculture. I think it's interesting now, people are trying to genetically engineer back into plants resistance that they originally had. I participated in a conference several years ago titled Farm Ecology, Pharmacological Aspects of Ecology. One of the most interesting presentations I heard was from a lady who came from the pharmaceutical industry. And she was talking about how valuable these secondary compounds are in plants and how the pharmaceutical industry really needs to go back to its roots, which was plants and plants for medicine. It was a fascinating talk, and I don't know how big of an impact she's going to have, but her message from her work in the pharmaceutical industry was simply that we need to go back and to have a think about all of this. So from a livestock standpoint, I would say then that nothing's more important for health through nutrition than landscapes with diverse arrays of plants. These are pictures taken this summer in the Gravelly Range. If you know about the Gravelly Range here west of south and west of Ennis, you know there's incredible mixtures of plant species, and the animals are so healthy that are on those landscapes there. There's neat research that's coming out now, and I've been able to review some of the papers and help with some of the work, but just reviewing some of the research papers that are coming out now where people are starting to look at, as you increase the diversity of a plant community, does that change the health of livestock? And they're looking at nutritional parameters, they're looking at physiological, they're looking at immunological parameters. I'm happy to share papers like that with folks if they're interested, but they're showing that the more diverse the community, the more healthy the animals are. There's some studies coming out of Logan nowadays that shows them that cattle and sheep both gain weight more efficiency with less emissions of greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide, and they reach slaughter weight as quickly as animals on feedlot when they're on diverse arrays of plant communities that have different species of tannins in the diet. Biochemically diverse diets enable sequences that complement one another as well. And I think about this for these unpalatable plants that we often think of. Animals don't want to eat these plants. Here's two examples we worked down over the years. One was with sheep and cattle on endophyte infected tall fescue. And we were showing that if animals have plants that contain tannins, like bird's foot trefoil or sandfoin, or it could be shrubs like bitterbrush, there are a number of tannin-containing species that if they learn to eat an appetizer of a plant like that, they can eat far more endophyte-infected tall fescue. Or sheep that learn to eat bitterbrush as an appetizer can eat far more sagebrush. And what's happening is these biochemical interactions between tannins in trefoil and alkaloids in this case here, or tannins and terpenes. The tannins are binding up these compounds, and so they don't have such an adverse effect on sheep and cattle. So biodiversity creates complementarities. Um, I gave a talk a few years back, and a producer came up and said, well, this helps to explain why what most people in my part of the country, which was Kansas, think of as the plant mix from hell, Sericea lespedisa and endophyte infected tall fescue, worked so well for me. He said, I put 4 daughters through college on this mix of plants with cattle. And it's simply, you've got a complementarity between the tannins in Sericea and the alkaloids in fescue. As I interact with people in different areas, they're telling me that livestock producers are finding that morbidity and mortality decrease when stocker cattle are allowed to forage on diverse mixtures of plants rather than on monocultures. One of the people I work with here in the Salmon, Idaho area, Glenn Elzinga, has very much come to appreciate that. And Becky, you mentioned one of the books that I was a co-author or a helper on, this Art and Science of Shepherding. That's basically what Glenn's doing on these extensive rangelands in the Salmon, Idaho area. And for the sake of time, I'll just barely mention, but what they do is move cattle, just like the French shepherds do, across those landscapes, exposing them to diverse arrays of plants. And both the flavor and the biochemical characteristics of that meat are really enhanced as a function of what Glenn's doing. I'll come back to that in just a minute. But one of the things that happens when you do that is when you move animals across landscapes, it enables individuals to regulate their intake of these primary and secondary compounds. As I mentioned earlier, no 2 individuals are alike in terms of the diets that they want to eat. And so if you expose them to different plant species, they can pick and choose to meet their own needs. So that stimulates appetite and intake. It also a way, though, to target graze to enhance and maintain biodiversity. And the people in France are very much appreciative of that. So when they look across a landscape like this shepherd here, he's thinking about these different habitat types and the degree to which they're either disgusting or first rate. And then he's thinking about, how do I move sheep in ways so that I can use appetizer phases, main course, dessert phases, and so forth, so that I can utilize all of the foods in this landscape rather than just focusing on first rate. And I'm not saying everybody should be a shepherd, and, certainly. I'm simply doing this for the ideas that what's palatable, what's not palatable. Well, it all depends, and our knowledge of plants and animals really can influence that. When I look back over from my very early years of just being fascinated with why animals, wild animals, eat what they eat, and then domestic animals on the ranch, and then the studies early on, we would find that 3 to 5 plants make up the bulk of the diet in any one meal. But animals will eat 50 to 75 different plants in a meal, throughout the day, just nibbling a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And I and all the people I knew used to discount that, because we would say, well, that's not providing the bulk of the food that's making animals grow and reproduce and so forth. And while that's true, what we missed is that these little bits of plants that they're eating are really enhancing health when livestock sample a little bit from a whole bunch of things. Those compounds are getting into their bodies, and they're getting into the circulatory system. And cells, at the cellular level, cells are able to select then compounds they need. I'll say a bit more of that in just a minute. So basically then what I would say is, landscapes with diverse plants enable animals to self-medicate. There's 2 ways. One is prophylactically, and that's what I was talking about here. There really is in enhancing their health medicinally from selecting diverse arrays of plants, and then therapeutically. And we did a lot of work on this to show that animals can actually self-medicate when they get sick. We didn't do this to animals, but again, a long story short, we just looked at so many different situations, and we showed for bloat, for acidosis, for excessive tannins, for excessive oxalates, and on and on and on, that animals can self-medicate. We also showed that they can learn to use different medicines for different maladies, just like we do. If you have a headache, you're going to select an aspirin. If you have a stomach ache, maybe Pepto-Bismol, they can do the very same thing. They learn to do that. So what I would end on this section is simply to say, I was talking about let feed be thy medicine. We can also think in that same way about let food be our medicine. As indigenous peoples and cultures in India, from Ayurveda to Chinese medicine, they recognize and appreciate the tremendous amount of health benefits from herbs and spices and fruits and vegetables, especially ones that are rich in these phytochemicals. And here's a partial list of some of the effects that are known to occur as a result of eating wholesome foods, kind of foods that you folks are interested in raising. So that takes me to let food be our medicine. And I want to talk about plant diversity, a diversity of the diet, and the social cultural part of that thing as I go along. And I'll begin with a book that Mark Schachter wrote, a Canadian author, The Dorito Effect. And Mark makes some really good points in that book. He begins by pointing out that the flavor of meat and produce have become blander and blander over the last 50 years. And we certainly recognize that in so much of the produce. It can look fabulous, but have no flavor whatsoever. Well, the same thing is true with meat as well. As we went to the feedlot system and grain-fed diets, that flavor of that food has lost its richness. Well, at the same time, as he points out, the flavor of processed foods have become all the more resistible. That's an amazing, just to get into that. And I interacted and attended conferences with people from that studied humans and that helped to create all of this over the years. And it's amazing. They know more about us than you can imagine. And I used to think when I'd be attending those conferences, we're studying sheep and goats and cows. Nobody really cares about a sheep, a goat, or a cow. But when it comes to humans and making money, that's where the money is. And so it's just incredible what they've figured out on how to make us like things that basically aren't so good for us. So we've disincentivized real food because they don't taste that good anymore. And we've made junk food all the more desirable. So let me build on that why real food doesn't taste good anymore. And I already mentioned this, that resource availability in the environment, sunlight, moisture, and nutrients influences soil, and that influences plant chemical characteristics, which are influencing soil, plant diversity, and chemistry. And we know there have been many papers written on this now, good reviews that point out that the phytochemical richness of the plants we eat, fruits and vegetables and grains, have declined 10 to 50% in the last, 70 years or so, a steady decline. And so that's well documented. And what I'd want to say is that the environments that we're growing those plants in, there's three things. One is the environment, so the amount of moisture and nutrients. When we irrigate and fertilize plants, we will often diminish phytochemical richness. We'll enhance growth at the expense of phytochemical richness. In fact, when plants are a bit stressed, they'll be more phytochemically rich as a generalization. But we've also, as I mentioned, selected for varieties that are low in phytochemical richness. So we enhance growth at the expense of richness. There are some research programs that I know about that are really trying nowadays to go back and to select again for phytochemical richness. And I'm happy to share information on that if people are interested. Well, that scales up then to milk and meat. This idea of plant diversity and chemistry, it influences the biochemical richness of the diets of animals, which influences the quality of milk, meat, and cheese. So let me say a few words about that. Probably dairy has been studied much more than meat has in this regard. But still, when it comes to looking at as you increase diversity on what plant species are in the diet, there's not as much work as it would be nice to have on milk and cheese. But one of the studies I'm thinking about here was done in Italy, I think was really fabulous. And what they did was they compared milk and cheese of dairy cattle that were raised either on diverse landscapes, feeding on plant diverse landscapes, or that were fed a total mixed ration of primarily high in grains and some cultivated forages. And what they found was that the flavor, both the flavor and the biochemical richness of milk and cheese were greatly enhanced when animals were on pasture compared to total mixed ration. And when they ran flavor preference tests, local people hands down preferred the flavor of milk and cheese from dairy cows grazing on these botanically diverse swards. The same kind of idea applies to meat, but there's even less work on that. And I want to go back and just make a point here. And this goes back to this diary of Warren Angus Ferris, Life in the Rocky Mountains. And there's a place in there where he's talking about the foods that they were eating. And he says, bison in pure flesh were the worst diet imaginable. But as they became fat, we grew strong and hardy, and now not one of us but is ready to insist that no other kind of meat can compare with that of a female bison in good condition. He goes on to say, with it, we require no seasoning. We boil, roast, fry it as we please, live upon it solely, without bread or vegetables of any kind. And what seems most singular, we never tire of or disrelish it, which would be the case with almost any other meat after living upon it exclusively for a few days. If you think about that, that's pretty amazing what he has to say there. I got a note recently from a friend who reflected the same way. He talked about buying some Wagyu cattle, and he said, you know, it's super fat, but no flavor. And then he bought some meat that was finished on these diverse landscapes. He said it was incredible. It was so nourishing. He and his wife both loved it. And he says his wife usually can't finish a steak. She devoured the whole thing. He said the point is it was so nourishing. And that's the point that Warren Angus Ferris is making here. So the flavor of meat is influenced by phytochemical richness of the diet, but really, honestly, we know very little about that. More generally, I would say our understanding of how diet affects health is limited to a very small number of nutritional components. When you start to look at the human foodome, it's incredibly complex. And so to try to understand or appreciate that, when it comes to wholesome foods, this number of 26,000 biochemicals is probably about a third of what's actually in the human foodome if you get into really what I'm talking about here. So what I want to mention is some research that I'm helping on. I'm a cheerleader, help write papers, proposals, get money for people. And there are two people that are key. One is Stefan van Vliet at Duke University, and they are set up, they're a powerhouse set up to do all the kind of trials that help to better understand what I'm talking about here. I have another colleague, Scott Kronberg, who works for USDA ARS in Mandan. And so we're kind of a team that's looking, we're comparing fake meat with meat from feedlots, with meat from animals foraging on phytochemically rich diets. We have funding to look at cattle. We're working with sheep from New Zealand. We're working with bison from here in the United States as well. And we're doing three kinds of trials. First, this big word here, metabolomic analyses for biochemical richness of meat. Metabolomics is simply a technique that you can use that helps you to get a handle on this great diversity of compounds rather than focusing on omega-3s or a limited number of things. Metabolomics is a way to try to get the full richness that's going on within a meat. And that includes not only biochemical richness, but also phytochemical richness, because it's clear that phytochemicals in the diets of animals will also get into the meat and fat as phytochemicals. Then we're also doing feeding trials for inflammation. And I'm going to say more about that in just a minute. And then longer term clinical trials where we look at what's the basal diet that a human's on. You know, if you look at most people in this country, um, the basal, the quote, Western diet loaded in ultra processed foods is not good for our health. And that basal diet that we're on is going to influence our response to meat and to other things. So we want to do clinical trials where we look at what Warren Angus Ferris and my friend was saying, the ability of different meat to satiate, its influence on inflammatory responses in the body, and then on our health more generally. So let me say a few words about these feeding, or about these metabolomics analyses and then the feeding trials. We have a paper that's just published where we compared ground beef, Glen Elzinga's meat, actually, a very phytochemically rich meat, with soy-based meat alternative, with pea-based meat alternative. And to make a long story short, I would simply say that there's really, hands down, this meat is much more phytochemically rich than either the soy-based or the pea-based alternative. Again, I'm happy to share papers we're writing on that and reviews, but that's the bottom line relative to, there's no comparison when you look at those. From this, looking at the human body and what does the body think, have to say when we eat these different kind of foods. I want to tell you about a study that was done in Australia back about 10 years ago. And what they were doing was comparing Wagyu cattle that were finished on total mixed rations in a feedlot with the meat from kangaroos who were foraging on phytochemically really rich diets. And they were looking at inflammatory response. The key to this idea of inflammation is to realize first that anytime we eat a meal, there's an inflammatory response in our body. Now, if we're eating really wholesome foods, that response is very low. If we're eating ultra processed and foods that aren't so great for us, that inflammatory response is high, and it becomes chronic if that's the diet that we're living on. And so that's what they were looking at, is comparing those two meats. And when people ate meat from the Wagyu, the inflammatory markers went up immediately and they stayed high for many hours after the meal. Eat the kangaroo, there's virtually no rise in those inflammatory markers. Well, I sent these guys a note and asked them, are you going to compare cattle that are on different kind of diets? And they said, no. Our interest was just to point out for people in Australia that if you want to eat healthy meat, you're going to eat meat from kangaroos, which if you've ever been in Australia or lived there as we did, you know, you can buy that right in the supermarket. So that's where our work is really picking up. We want to look at that and do clinical trials as well. That's related then. I mentioned that when animals are on diverse diets, those phytochemicals actually get into the meat. And if you think back to Warren Angus Ferris, he said, we don't need meat or vegetables. Well, they're getting some of that right from the meat, if you think about it. And that's related then to this idea of herbs and spices. Why do people add herbs and spices to these feedlot kind of meats? Well, it enhances flavor, it can enhance health. There's some really interesting studies related to these, the importance of polyphenols in red wine relative to decreasing alleged adverse effects in meat and so forth. So herbs and spices, we like them because they're good for us. And I'm trying to relate that then to this meat. You know, so herbs and spices added to foods enhance palatability. They enhance satiation and satiety, and they reduce the alleged adverse effects of eating red meat. There's really interesting work that's been done across the board on that. Again, I'm happy to share if people want more. It's interesting to realize too that Native Americans made pemmican from meat and wild berries, and those wild berries would be playing roles as well. Not that the meat that they were getting wasn't already phytochemically rich, but it's simply to kind of acknowledge that and to try to relate it. You know, there's a study recently published out of Morocco. One of the that deals with this idea of cancer and the cancer-causing effects of meat, the alleged cancer-causing effects of meat. But what they were showing was that eating traditionally processed meats was not associated with any sort of increased risk of cancer in people in Morocco. And one of the reasons they were arguing that's the case is they say, well, the way we process meats, look at what we use: olive oil, herbs, and spices such as cumin, garlic, coriander, salt, and vinegar. They're arguing that's really important. Processed meat isn't processed meat isn't processed meat. It depends how you do that. So when you get phytochemicals into the diet, into meat or whatever, people have shown diet-induced changes in DNA methylation can counter all of the hallmarks of cancer cells. So these compounds have really important influences at a cellular level. And that's where I would say, too, that the more we go from combinations of wholesome foods to individual foods, to worse yet, to individual compounds, for instance, garlic capsules. The complexity of a garlic capsule phytochemically compared to a garlic clove, there's nowhere near the phytochemical complexity in a capsule compared to a clove. And then when you get to these diverse combinations of meat, foods, and again, there's a recognition that's occurred at least a bit in the human literature that it's these rich combinations of foods that are really generate health, that are important in generating health. Beyond that, I think, you have these wars over we should just be eating plants or we should just be eating meat. I have so many people I know that argue in one way or the other. But the fact is, most humans are omnivores, and plants provide, and here I won't read that, they provide a whole bunch of nutrients that meats don't provide so readily. Plus, they have all the phytochemicals. On the other hand, meats provide a whole bunch of things that plants don't have. And it's the reason that most of us really thrive on an omnivorous kind of diet. As we've moved away from eating omnivorous, wholesome diets, the accent on wholesome, to ultra-processed diets, that's really led to this crisis of obesity and diet-related diseases. And a study published just a year or so ago was showing they were comparing ultra-processed diets with unprocessed, wholesome diets. And they were presented in a random order and matched for calories, that is energy, sugar, fat, fiber, and macronutrients. So they matched the diets for that. But what they found was that if people were on the ultra-processed diet, they ate so much more food every day throughout that study compared to being on the wholesome diet. And as a result, they gained weight. Even over 2 weeks, they were gaining weight compared to the people on the wholesome diet. Well, processed foods do little to induce satiation or satiety, and so people overeat and gain weight. It's a really, really key point and a really good study to simply show eating wholesome foods, plant and animal foods, is really a key to health. The ultra-processed foods have created a pandemic of obesity and diet-related diseases, whose symptoms the medical, pharmaceutical industries treat at enormous cost. It's really a vicious cycle that we get into here. If you look at the figures, 75% of the people in the US are overweight or obese, 50% pre-diabetic or diabetic, 88% are metabolically unhealthy, and 80% aren't really fit to serve in the military. It's really where we've ended up today. And it's the same for our pets too, and I won't go off into this much, but I've gotten linked into this with some of the people in the pet world, and our pets are no better off than we are. And a lot of the diseases that our pets are suffering as a result of the processed diets they're on. So we've extracted the compound from the food from the diet from the culture, and we have little notion of how meal patterns or food combinations and all this I've been talking about are really influencing our health. And that brings me to this last topic, this whole social cultural part of things. And I simply would begin by pointing out that these experiences early in life, from really the womb, from the in utero experiences through early experiences, are influence food and habitat preferences in every creature that's ever been looked at, from insects and fishes to birds and mammals. Earthworms acquire preferences for the habitat that they're born and raised in. And if you think about it, why is that? When we were living in the backwoods of Colorado, my wife and I, these beautiful mountain bluebirds would come early in the spring in March of the year, and then they'd leave in October, November to go to fly south to the neotropics where they live. But when I would talk with ornithologists, they'd tell me, those birds, if you ban them, you'll realize that those birds know your place. The same bird comes back to nest in the same place in your area there. Why do they do that? Well, it's the home field advantage in life. We talk about it in sports, but for these creatures, it's the home field advantage in life, knowing what and what not to eat, where and where not to go, what's a predator, what's not a predator. If your neighbor gives a particular call, bird call, what does that tell you as a rabbit in that environment? All those things these animals are learning. So it's no surprise then that there's a rich literature on humans to show that experiences in utero and early in life are having a profound effect on the foods that we like to eat. Flavors of foods in mom's diets gets into the amniotic fluid, and the fetal taste system's fully functional during the last trimester of gestation. So the young baby is already learning what food is. And then after birth, flavors in mother's milk are cues to the foods that mother's eating and the foods that are being offered. So our preferences, our understanding of what food is, our preferences for foods really have their origins early in life. That was illustrated best ever by these studies that Clara Davis did nearly 100 years ago. And what she was doing was working with young children that were given up for adoption. I think there were 15 children that she studied over a 6-year period. And what they did was, from this list of 34 different ingredients, they offered those children a choice of those ingredients seasonally throughout the 6-year trial. And the nurses working on the study were instructed not to just to put those foods on the babies in front of the baby and let them select however they wanted to select. And it was interesting to read. She said, initially the children showed no knowledge that they innately knew which foods they liked and wanted to eat or not. They put everything in their mouth, from the napkins to the silverware to all the different foods. They sampled them all. But then with time, each individual child came to select a diet that it liked best from the choices that were available to it. If some of them came up into the study deficient, for instance, some had rickets, that would really influence that. They wanted to cod liver oil was something that they would readily select. If you've ever had that, if your mother ever made you have that when you were young, it's not so great, but they would readily ingest it until the deficiency was gone. So Clara concludes the results leave the selection of the foods to be made available to young children in the hands of their elders, where everyone has always known it belongs. This whole idea of transgenerational linkages and cultural linkages. But, that hasn't been the case. The choices that we've learned to make are now so strongly influenced by corporate, political, and academic elders, as people in many, many books have documented. And now the transgenerational effects that we're seeing are things like metabolic syndrome, as a result of mothers who gain excessive weight during pregnancy, mothers who are obese, mothers who become diabetic during pregnancy. They're more likely to have fatter babies with higher incidence of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer. All this is really well documented. And I think back to cases I know of people, families that I've known from 40 years ago. And when kids were born, I think of this often. If the mother was eating a really healthful diet, I look at those children now and they're thin, they're not heavy, but thinking of some mothers that they switched, you know, early on they were on more wholesome diets. As they went along, they ate more ultra processed foods. And the kids that came later are really now struggling with huge issues of obesity and diet related diseases. Well, you know, pancreas develops the anatomy and physiology of this, let's say, is really well documented on what's happening internally related to this transgenerational metabolic syndrome. Well, the same things is which is what we studied in livestock, that mothers' experiences starting in the womb and early in life have a lifelong influence on food and habitat selection. Just a couple of examples really quickly here. We showed in studies when we were looking at feeding ammoniated straw during the winter as the way to cut the costs of feeding. Many years ago, we did this to reduce the costs of winter feeding. We were doing studies in utero, and we had mothers that were on straw diets. And we found that their offspring, when they became mothers, they ate more straw, they digested straw better, and they grew faster than calves that had not been exposed to straw. So you have this effect that's starting even in the womb. We also did studies with that followed up on that. And in this case here, we had animals that were 5 years old when we began the study. It was a 3-year study then, so they went from 5 to 8 years of age. We had animals that had been exposed to straw early in life and animals that hadn't. And then I make this point, it's 5 years later. They haven't seen straw for 5 years, these ones that were exposed. But throughout all 3 years of that study, those ones that were exposed early in life had higher body condition and higher body weight and condition. They produced more milk. They had shorter postpartum intervals when they were fed the bulk of their diet during pregnancies from 5 to 8 years of age. So it's just showing that there's these long-term effects. They're epigenetic kind of effects. Genes are being expressed as a function of diet that are enabling animals. When we did move to working with livestock producers on winter grazing and wintering animals out and using poor quality foods, this becomes so relevant because you've prepared the animal for the foods that it's going to need to eat and to their bodies to be better able to utilize those foods, to digest and utilize those foods. And all these are early life experiences. Our colleagues in Australia did the same thing on saltbrush. They have saltbrush ranges in Western Australia, and they were simply showing lambs exposed to saltbrush in utero grow faster, handle a salt load better than lambs from mothers on pastures. They excrete salt more rapidly, drink less water, and maintain higher intakes when they're eating saltbrush. I mentioned earlier on that an appetizer of bitterbrush helps the sagebrush to go down. And I want to talk about a study briefly here that was done at the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station in DuBois, Idaho. And they were selecting for a flock from within their flock of 5,000 sheep for a small flock of sagebrush eating sheep to reduce the abundance of sagebrush on some of the Western landscapes. And they were able to, by doing fecal analyses, identify sheep that ate a lot of sagebrush. So they created their flock of these sagebrush eaters. And we all thought that it was physiological changes that were enabling those sheep. Then they started studying what the food selection patterns of the sheep, and they found that these sheep had learned that an appetizer of bitterbrush helps the sagebrush go down. They were using bitterbrush as a way to counter the effects of sagebrush. So a learned behavior that becomes a part of the culture of the herd, and animals that learn that are able to do something that animals that didn't learn it can't do. So I'll end this part by simply saying that environments influence gene expression, this whole idea of epigenetics, which then influences form, function, and behavior of animals. And it's well documented. For the sake of time, I won't explain, from neural responses to how the rumen develops, to how kidneys function and develop. All those sort of things are mediated. I do want to mention this book, A Change of Heart, a memoir by Claire Sylvia, written many years ago. She was one of the first people to ever have organ transplant, and she had a heart and lung transplant. And what she had to say about after that occurred relates to so much of what I've been touching on here. And I'll begin with when she was being interviewed after she had had the surgery. She was on an exercise bike, and the reporters came and they asked her about what she'd gone through. And then the last question was, if you could have anything you want to eat right now, what would that be? And she said, actually, I'd like to have a beer. And she said the minute the words came out of her mouth, she was shocked for two reasons. She said, one, it was kind of a flippant response to an honest question. And she said, two, I don't even like beer. So then she goes in to explain how when you end up, and the book is about how she found out the changes that occurred in her and how she found out where her heart and lung came from. She got the heart and lung from a 20-year-old male who had died in a motorcycle accident. Tim was his name. And she said, you know, when you put the organs of a young man into your body, you're not the same anymore. He had learned patterns of behavior that were totally different from the patterns that I learned. And so her food preferences had broadened out. She didn't lose the ones she liked, but her heart and lungs had developed their own preferences. And this idea of feeding back, the organs are saying, you know, we like green peppers. You never liked green peppers before. We want green peppers. We like beer. We like chicken McNuggets and so forth. So it's simply trying to say that her experiences really links back with a lot of what I've been trying to talk about and how I'll end here. So I'd say, like Farside said here, therefore, after a 40-year case study, it's my contention couch potatoes actually begin to develop early in life as tater tots. And I have one more piece here that I really want to build on this. If you think about what I'm talking about, and I think a lot about it anymore, is you start to think, well, okay, if all this starts to influence me from when I'm in the womb of my mother, who is this person I call Fred? Who is this person I call myself? What is this self that I'm talking about? So, what price do we pay when we ignore transgenerational linkages to social and biophysical environments? And how does that relate to this question I'm starting to pose? So let's end on this wisdom of the body. And, you know, historically, for our ancestors, their palates linked them functionally and intimately with the landscapes they inhabited. There's no question about it. That was the way it was, the ancestral diets. Then we have Holocene evolution as we went on. And now we have today where we are with all these debates that take place over plants versus meat diets versus one thing or another. And it's incredibly confusing. Even scientists I know who aren't directly involved in nutrition, but who are very knowledgeable, say it's just totally confusing to us, you know, about the whole effects on human health, the whole effects on the environment and climate change. It's very confusing. So if we stick just with nutrition, you can think of just in your lifetime, if you've lived long, the whole thing of, you know, eggs used to be something that everybody loved. Then it got into the whole cholesterol issue, and it's don't touch eggs. The whole issues related to wholesome foods and refined carbs, meats and saturated fats. So it is confusing. I think it's incredibly confusing for people. And I'm going to show you a little video that highlights all of it. I don't know if you've seen that before or not, but I find that just captures the essence so well of all that's going on. So let's go back to this question I posed. Who is this self that I call myself? When you think of that in relation to from the minute you're conceived, you're already getting an influence from your mother. And it's not just about foods, it's about many, many influences that are in her environment. She's been influenced by her family and all of its connections, which has been influenced by the community, the broader community that is born and raised in, which is influenced by the broader culture. I'm trying to say, you know, you have all these linkages, and then you say, well, this is what I think, but who is this I that's doing the thinking? What is it? What is this self is really the question I want to get at here. And I want to begin by pointing out that we have this cognitive, rational, analytical self that's always thinking and analyzing and trying to figure out things. Then we have this non-cognitive, intuitive, synthetic part of ourself. And that's the part, that's the flavor feedback, biochemically mediated flavor feedback interactions that I was talking about. It's this non-cognitive part of us that knows, that simply has this wisdom. But this cognitive, rational, analytical part, all that we hear can greatly override the non-cognitive, intuitive, synthetic part of our being. And so let me give you some examples of that, beginning with some studies that are just being published. And what they're showing is that they're talking about vegetarians and vegans. And well, they report a low desire to eat meat. They don't want to eat meat, right? When you do brain scans on them, their neural activity reveals an inherent craving for meat. So that's showing what I'm saying here. You have, and for it can be for good reasons, right? I'm not criticizing people for the diets they eat. It can be for very good reasons. Maybe they don't like the confinement feeding operations and they don't like killing animals and so forth. But there's this inherent craving for meat. So these findings highlight the dissonance between acquired beliefs and attitudes and inherent needs for nutrients contained in meat. I've written a paper that I'm happy to share with anyone titled "We Are the Earth and the Earth is Us" that really gets into some of this topic if you're interested in that. It's been accepted for publication. It'll be out fairly soon. But that's also revealed in different kind of studies that people do. Paul Rosen, who studied psychology of people for his career and did many, many interesting studies, did one survey that was related to studies he was doing. And he said, you know, imagine that you're going to be stranded on an island and you can only take one food with you. Which food would you want to take with you? And he's doing this to reveal this inherent bias that's gotten into the psyche of people in the US at least. So here's the choices that he gives people. And what does he find? 42% going to a tropical island, let's take bananas, you know, and you have 12% corn, 7% alfalfa sprouts, spinach, 27, 5% peaches, 4% for hot dogs, 3% for milk. The foods that would get you the best, furthest down the road, be most wholesome of that very limited choice are the two foods that nobody wants to take. They didn't want to take hot dogs. They didn't want to take whole milk, chocolate milk. And this was part of broader studies that were simply showing how fat became toxic here in the US. And a lot of that goes back to Ansel Keys and the work that he did on cholesterol, saturated fat, and diet. And he had an enormous, enormous influence. If you've read that literature, you understand what I mean. But a lot of that can be tied back to him. If you go in the grocery stores now, and you know, the meat is much leaner. There's so much choice in terms of margarine and so forth, as opposed to butter. Skim milk, low fat, as opposed to full fat. And in fact, trying to find full fat anything in the store is a little bit of a challenge. So meat became toxic that way. How fat stays toxic, this Eat Lancet report that probably many of you are familiar with, that's arguing that we should basically eat plant-based diets, is another pitch for how to meat should stay toxic basically, and how fat and those kinds of things. So simply saying that this gets into the psyche of individuals and into the psyche of a culture, and it's totally influenced. I remember my father-in-law in his last years absolutely loved eggs, but all that was coming out on negative of eggs, grandma decided no eggs, you know, so that's it. And yet his body knew the value of eggs and he loved eggs, but It gets into the psyche. So we stop listening then to the wisdom of our own body and yield to advice from authority figures. Rather than going inward and trying to say, well, what is it that my body actually wants, and exposing our bodies to wholesome foods as a part of that. And so these experiences influence what we perceive, how we believe, and how we behave. And I'll just give 3 examples really quickly here of that. Here's one study where they offered people the same, it's the identical piece of meat. There's no difference whatsoever in the origins of this meat, but it's what they told people, just like that video was showing, that influenced what they came to, how they experienced that meat. Meats were paired with descriptions of, of animals raised on factory or humane farms. And for all the people in this study, if they learned it was from a factory farm, they thought the samples looked and smelled less pleasant, tasted saltier and greasier. It's a huge example of how what we're told influences how we experience that. It's amazing to me. And I know I do it too, so I'm not trying to act like I'm any different. But with gluten, all that's come out about gluten. And this is not to say that there aren't people that have sensitivities, but we know that many people don't. They simply think that they have it. And one of the studies that showed that people fed high gluten, low gluten, no gluten foods, regardless of what they were fed, people who believed that they had gluten sensitivities experienced pain, bloating, nausea, and gas, regardless. So again, it's this whole idea. If you're told that this has gluten, your body's conditioned to where you're going to have that experience. The last example I'll give you is simply to show that there's a physiological basis. We say, well, it's all in your head. And yes, it is in your head, but it's in every organ system in your body. It's a total physiological response. And there's several studies to show this, but the one I'll use here is with milkshakes. And as a response, they were measuring ghrelin, which is referred to as the hunger hormone. It affects appetite and plays key role in the rate and use and distribution of energy in the body. So it's an important home run. But here's the fun thing that they did. If they told people, so ghrelin decreases after an 80-calorie milkshake. So they're given an 80-calorie milkshake labeled indulgent 620 calories, but not after a milkshake, the identical milkshake labeled sensible 140 calories. So the ghrelin response is totally a function, in this case, of what they're being told, not of the calories in the milkshake. So those are some examples of the physical part of this. I want to give a couple that go move from the physical to get a bit the metaphysical, actually. And I'll start with one very interesting story I read several years ago. It was published in AARP, and I read follow-ups on this after, but it was about a man named John Whitley. He was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, which is really a death sentence. It's all over for you. But as they say, determined to beat the odds, he entered a trial where some people got an experimental drug and others got the placebo. At a ritual every day, every afternoon, he sat in his apartment and took the drug, and he told himself, this is a miracle drug. It's going to save my life. And he believed that at the deepest level. So the trial ends, and he goes back and he visits the oncologist, and the oncologist says, John, I have amazing news for you. Your cancer is gone. We are not finding any evidence whatsoever of your pancreatic cancer. And he says, but let me tell you the rest of the story. Here's what's amazing. You were in the placebo group. You weren't getting the drug. And so it shows the power of what we believe to influence not only what we eat, but also our response to the environments that we're in, this whole linkage. The last example then that I'll give here comes from a book that was recommended to me many years ago. It's titled Dying to Be Me, My Journey from Cancer to Near Death to True Healing. And she says there in that byline, after she had when she was experiencing this near-death experience, she said, I had the choice to come back or not come back. She said, I chose to return when I realized that heaven is a state, not a place. So let me give you the background on this. So she was a very, very conflicted lady. And the conflicts came from all these different messages she was receiving from when she was a very young girl. She was raised in a strict Hindu family, who had a very strong controlling father figure who, this is the way it is and you don't vary from this. Well, she had this Buddhist maid, though, that was always talking to her about Buddhist views, and that uh, they sometimes weren't congruent with some of her Hindu beliefs. She was attending a Christian boarding school, and when she told them about their Hindu and Buddhist beliefs, they said, we're very critical, basically. So, there's no way you're going to heaven. You're doomed, and things like that. So that was her start, and she was conflicted her whole life as a result of that. She said after losing 2 friends to cancer and a diagnosis of lymphoma herself, she began to study everything she could about holistic health and Western and Eastern healing systems. When none of these worked, she decided to go to India and to get under an Ayurveda system. And so she did that. She got with a guru in India. He put her on a vegetarian diet and had her start to meditate, do the kind of things that John Whitley was doing. And after 6 months, her cancer was cured. She was good. But then she returned to China, and her friends said, man, you look fabulous. What'd you do? And when she started to explain what she'd been doing, she started to receive all these fear-based negative kind of responses again. And she was still really susceptible to that. So then she began experimenting with other ways of healing. She attempted traditional Chinese medicine common in Hong Kong, but because of its conflict with Ayurveda, she was quite confused. In traditional Chinese medicine, you're encouraged to eat meat, especially pork. In Ayurveda, you're encouraged to be a vegetarian, and meat's the worst thing you can eat. So again, the conflicts continued. So in the end, her organ systems failed. She slipped into a coma, death imminent. It's then that she had the near-death experience that changed her life. And she says, after years of trying to meet everyone else's expectations, she finally realized, as a result of this near-death experience, she alone held the power to heal herself physically and spiritually, that she had to go inward to find this self that she is. And this brings me to my last example. Many, many years ago, I was driving home from the airport in Salt Lake City, and the radio was on, and I was listening to this program. They were launching a new program, and it was modeled after Edwin R. Murrow's program, This I Believe. He started his radio program after World War II during the Red Scare, when all that was permeating the society here, and people were kind of polarized and fear-based. And he wanted to use this as a way for people to be able to express themselves on the radio and to share that with people around the country. The book has sold more books than any book beside the Bible, The Personal Philosophies of 100 Thoughtful Men and Women. So they were replaying some of what these people said, and they were only on for like 5 minutes. And it was so interesting, really, to think back to then and then to think what they were saying. But there was one person came on, and we had been studying all this in utero early life, and I've been thinking about this so much, as what is this self? And this guy came on, he said, I can tell you what I've been taught to believe by my family, my church, my community, my country, so on. But to be honest with you, I don't know what it is that this self of mine actually believes in the absence of all I've been taught. And I've thought about that so much over the years. We identify with our family, community, culture, religion, profession, politics, all of what I call the I ams, all these layer of I ams. But if you think about it, if you change the context, if you're born in a different time and place, all of the I ams change. All of that changes. So what's sacred about the I am? Nothing is sacred about it in the end. It's only when we come to transcend all of the I ams that we actually come to I am. And that indeed is a huge, huge challenge. That's not easy at all to do that physically or spiritually. But that to me is the wisdom of the body that resides within each one of us at the deepest level. So I'll conclude by saying, back to the food, we've made an art form of dining, but in a lot of ways our culture has tabled these larger questions. In the one sense, eating is participating in endless transformation as plants and animals are killed and eaten. As I eat, the energy and matter in someone, and plants are conscious and sentient. This paper I mentioned that will be published soon, I really spend a lot of time. It's titled, We Are the Earth is Us. How Palates Link Food, Land, Heart, and Mindscapes. And in the heartscape part, I talk about the sentience of plants and animals both. They're all sentient, so it's someone that's eating. So this someone becomes me, this thing I call, this self I call, quote, me, which will in the flicker of cosmic eye return to earth as plants and animals. What is this consciousness, these atoms of consciousness, yesterday's meat and vegetables, huh? So in pondering this mystery, we may come to realize that all life is sacred. We are members of nature's communities. What we do to them, we do to ourselves. Only by nurturing them can we nurture ourselves. And I think for me anyway, we do that best by declaring love, not one another, not war on one another and the landscapes that we inhabit. And with that, I thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with all of you today. I only wish it could be in person to do this.
Well, thank you so much, Fred. As expected, you covered a lot of territory, crossed a lot of boundaries. I would just like to start with one comment that somebody sent me privately, but it captures some of this. She said, "This is fabulous. U.S. dietary guidelines should be thrown out and replaced with a messaging campaign. Observe nature, eat like that." But there is one question that Ken Kaling asked.
Let me say one thing
Yeah.
to that, Becky. Amen to that. You know, honestly, it could be an amen to that. Keep going, but it's so true, huh?
Okay. Oh, that was Mary Stein's comment. There's one thing that Ken Kaling early on asked a question, and it's a question that I actually had before you even began your talk, at least in some version. He asked, how can we rebuild natural plant diversity in rangeland and in pastures in the fittest way? And I was asking the question in terms of, there are places in Montana and in France and elsewhere where we have the luxury of managing herds over broad landscapes, over big altitude changes. But that is not possible in many parts of the globe and on many ranches. Just for the sake of argument, on a ranch like ours, which is only 160 acres, I've tried to put into practice many of the ideas you talk about. And for several years, I've been feeding minerals cafeteria style, and it is clearly has improved our animal health. But the question I'm asking is really like Ken's question. Have you thought much about the ways that we can really alter our management practices to begin to incorporate some of the real plant diversity that is present in rangelands that haven't been reworked by humans? And what would it take really to incorporate some of the native shrubs along with the cover crop diversity that we're already all talking about?
Becky, that's such a good question, actually. I think that's the essence. So how do we manage in ways that enhance biodiversity of landscapes, and then also that enable the animals that we care for to utilize that kind of biodiversity. You know, I don't have a simple answer to that, but during the decade of the 2000s, we had a program called Behave, and I say we, by the end of that 10 years, there were 250 of us would meet each year, once a year. And we were so focused on issues like that and just doing different kind of, thinking about the practices that we were doing, thinking about our grazing management, thinking about so many different ways that we could use that management to enhance biodiversity, to enhance the health of animals. I think it's absolutely the key question. And to me, what became pretty interesting and obvious was it really depended on each person's place, and then looking at that place and thinking about that place and just brainstorming. And we did that so much in those meetings. People would give presentations about issues and challenges, and we would all talk about the issues and challenges. And then we would also, if we thought it was worthwhile to do some research project related to that, we would do that. But, perhaps in getting together groups, like small groups like that, or people that would share that, I think that's absolutely, the question you two are asking is absolutely key. And I think it gets down to each place, but there's so many knobs and dials that can be worked with what I've talked about here today. But then, grazing management and timing and species and all those things, that it really becomes a very creative endeavor, and one with so many possibilities. So I know I didn't, I didn't just, I know I probably haven't, but I would be happy always to visit with people more about that, to come look at places, to brainstorm on that. That was what was fun about Behave, and having all the different people involved in that and thinking about ways. For instance, I'm thinking of one guy in Oregon, a rancher up there in Oregon, who tried his whole career to get rid of sagebrush with chemical, mechanical kinds of means. And we were learning about how to utilize sagebrush, how to do that, and how to utilize it as a winter forage. And the idea was nobody wants a monoculture of sagebrush. We'd like more diversity. And so we did 5 years of work that led up to what he did. And just showing that there's things you can do to really enhance intake of sagebrush and to really increase the biodiversity of those landscapes. And we were demonstrating that, and he started into that, and then he gave a talk at one of those, and he said, I wish I had a penny for every dollar I spent trying to get rid of sagebrush, because now it's not a problem. And so, it really gets down to the specific place and working on the place, I guess what I'm saying. And I loved being involved in all that over those years, and would still, be happy to be involved in those kind of things.
Well, that's
Is that a good enough non-answer to you?
No, that's an excellent answer. Now that I know you live in Ennis, I might just take you up on that.
May I add something to that? Just
yes, Ken.
Yes.
Yeah, I came over from southeast Minnesota on the Mississippi Blufflands, where I spent the total population of the county, Houston County, was 18,000 people, all small ranchers and small herds, and really dissected landscape. And I got involved with plants out there and restoration and burning and everything. And I had some plant lists of over 2,000 plants I claimed within 5 to 10 miles of my house, and up through Oak Hickory, stand right behind the house. I came out on a goat's prairie that had an expanse of over 700 plants. So when I came out here after years, I was here as a kid, but I mean, more recently where I really understood rangeland a little better, everything just seemed decimated. And when I tell people that I had thousands of prairie plants in my backyard. They just shake their heads. They don't even believe it. So the concept culturally is lost in that case, where people really don't know what it's like to walk through the expanse of a truly native prairie or grassland. So do you feel like that sometimes? You can't explain it because it's out of mind. It's gone, you know.
Yes, oh, I do, Ken, I do. And, usually I didn't keep it in this presentation, but one of the things I like to talk about is that idea of diversity and how it is gone. And in this paper, We Are the Earth, I talk some about that. But, so we have an acre and a half here in Innis, and most of the places around are monocultures of Kentucky bluegrass, which are kept in place with great expense, right? You have the water, you have the fertilizer that's added and so forth, and then you mow that thing all the time. And the little place we have here had a little bit of lawn. We've allowed it to become totally infested with clover, so it's very green. We don't have to fertilize. But to your point, more, what we've tried to do is encourage all the native plants in this place here. And it's fun to have the neighbors come, and some shake their heads and think this is horrible, but others say it's amazing. It's the flavor of what you're saying, and it wouldn't be as many species, but you know, we all know this. As you go seasonally from the spring and the different mixes of different forbs and grasses that are coming on the cool season to the summer and then to the autumn and the shrubs. And I often think, how could we as a culture come to appreciate and then appreciate diversity and move away from um, this monoculture mentality as well? Here on our place now, we grow vegetable, herbal, and medicinal gardens. We've got some chickens and ducks, and just this idea of diversity and these linkages, how animals can be a part of generating diversity. And so I totally appreciate what you're saying, and you do think how if we've even lost it in the farming and ranching folks, we can all imagine in folks like just down, and I'm not criticizing any folks in where I live here. We like them all, but how could they even, what's part of our psyche is what looks pretty as a monoculture of Kentucky bluegrass, and you don't want a dandelion in it. And so some folks down the roads, this herbicide isn't working so well on our dandelions anymore. It must be a bad batch. And my wife's, you ever heard of antibiotic resistance? Well, it's the same thing with those.
I'm going to have to interrupt here for just a moment. And that is and may have to be the good note on which to end this thing. It's 2:49, and we have to close with a little bit of a break before the next session begins at 3. But I think our collective marching orders to reclaim and expand plant, bio, animal, human diversity is maybe not a bad place to end up. Do you have any last things you'd like to say, Fred?
Oh, just thank you all for participating. I just wish I could be there with you. And if there's anything I can share that I mentioned, I'm happy to share it. But thank you all very much for the chance to be here with you. That's what I say.
Yeah, I think several of us are eager to get a hold of the paper that you referred to, the one that's about to come out. So maybe you can leave information with Jamie on how we can access that paper when it's ready.
Yes, I'll send that to Jamie. It's been reviewed. It's just going to press now, so I can send that. I'm very happy to do that, and anything else. And I'm happy to come visit with you. I'm your neighbor in a way now, at least in the Montana.
Yeah, well, I will definitely follow up on that score, and really appreciate your generosity. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks to all of you too.
I have faith we'll meet again next year in person.
I do want to say, Fred, thank you for having the courage and the humility to end that presentation like you did with that mystical angle there.
Well, Eric, I'm glad you appreciate it. I always wonder, but I so think that's so valuable to that quest, that inner quest. when you start to really ponder that, it goes deep. And it's not so straightforward, actually. Meditation, inquiry, contemplation, you really, and like the enlightened ones tell us, it'll take you to something that's, it'll take you to the absolute, actually, huh?
Yeah, well, thanks for that. I
You
appreciate it.
bet. You bet.
Yeah.